Well, good afternoon and welcome to the Idahoan Show. Every once in a while I get a comment asking about the status of my channel. You know, am I self-supporting? What do I do for a living? Something along those lines. Well, the truth is that at this point, for me, making videos is really just a hobby. You know, I make a little bit of money off of advertising revenue, but not nearly enough to break even on my projects, let alone enough to think about living on. So, you know, I work full-time as an engineer, that's how I support myself, and then, you know, the stuff you see on the show is stuff I do in my spare time. Now, that said, I have seen a lot of growth in the viewership of this channel this year, and so that's gotten me thinking a little bit more about the future of this channel. I certainly have a lot of project ideas that I would like to act on eventually. Lately I've been making a lot of barrels for the Utah pistol, particularly a lot of muzzleloader barrels, experimenting with different calibers, different rifling styles, stuff like that. I've got some more barrel making experiments that I still want to do, both with muzzleloader barrels and also moving up into some more centerfire barrels. But going beyond that, I'd also like to build a number of standalone muzzleloading firearms. I thought it'd be fun to build a blunderbuss. You know, that's kind of one of those more unique muzzleloaders that you don't see as often, and it'd be pretty easy to build one, I think. And then I had the idea of building what I'm going to call an Idahoan long rifle. You know, we've all seen the old Kentucky rifles and Pennsylvania long rifles. You know, basically just a long-barreled muzzle-loading rifle. And with a longer barrel like that, you actually can get a little bit more velocity out of a muzzleloader. So I'd like to take that concept and combine it with, you know, sort of a more modern, you know, AR-15 style ergonomics to build, well, what I'm going to call an Idahoan long rifle. And then I'd also like to try building a muzzle-loading shotgun. You know, shotguns operate at relatively low pressure anyways, and so you can probably get just about the same velocity as with a muzzleloader as you could with a typical 12 gauge. And yet, with a muzzleloader, because they're classified as antique firearms and therefore not regulated as firearms, you don't have to worry about the length restrictions and the barrel length and, you know, parameters like that that ATF controls rather stringently for centerfire shotguns. So it might be fun to build a, you know, like a muzzle-loading coach gun, you know, short-barrel, double-barrel shotgun or something. Getting a little bit more ambitious, I'd like to eventually try building a progressive muzzleloader. This was a very early repeating rifle concept where you had a series of charges stacked on top of each other in the barrel, and then separate flash holes to ignite them, either with a percussion cap or with a flintlock mechanism. And so you could have, you know, potentially a 4 or 5 shot muzzleloader with just a single barrel. Eventually I'd like to try building a Harmonica Gun. This is another early repeating rifle concept. Firearms historians tend to throw out the Harmonica Gun as kind of a ridiculous idea. I'm not convinced that that was the case. I think that the Harmonica Gun concept was more of an idea that was a good idea, but the implementation failed. You know, they never quite developed it to the point of being a practical, shootable firearm, and that was why it never caught on. And maybe when Harmonica guns were being made commercially, the technology to make it a practical, shootable gun just wasn't available. But I think that with a few little tweaks to the design, I might be able to make a pretty interesting firearm out of it that's actually somewhat practical, or at least would have been practical back in the day when muzzle-loading rifles were the rule instead of just a novelty. Now, speaking of muzzle-loading repeaters, I have toyed with the idea of building a muzzle-loading Gatling gun, sort of a marriage of a progressive reloading press with a Gatling gun, where you have a magazine of primers and a magazine of powder and a magazine of shot, and you crank the handle and it loads a powder charge into one barrel, and it loads a ball into the next barrel, and it loads a primer onto the next barrel, and it fires one of the barrels, and just goes around and cycles and gives you a very high rate of fire from a muzzle loading contraption, because it really would be the Rube Goldberg contraption of firearms at that point. So I'm not sure if I'll ever get around to that one, but that was another entertaining idea that I had. Now, building muzzleloaders is a lot of fun because they operate at relatively low pressures, so they're a little bit safer to get started with, and there's also not as many regulations governing them, so not as many things you have to pay attention to in that regard. But I do eventually want to get into building some more centerfire firearms as well. In addition to making some more centerfire barrels for the Utah, I'd like to build sort of a second-generation Utah-type gun as a carbine, rather than a pistol, and make it a little bit bigger so that it'll handle, full-size rifle and shotgun barrels. The idea being that I'd like to, well, one, I'd like to experiment with some different types of shotgun chokes. I've got some ideas for sort of some unorthodox chokes that would be interesting to experiment with. And then it would be nice to have the ability to chamber something like the Utah in full-powered rifle cartridges, like the 308 and other cartridges along those lines. But then, eventually, I would also like to start making some centerfire repeaters. It seems like most YouTube craftsmen will do a 9mm blowback semi-automatic for their first repeater project. I could build something along those lines. Then again, because other people have done it, it seems kind of unoriginal, so I'm not sure if I'll follow suit on the blowback 9mm or not. I do eventually want to build a lever-action 40 S&W rifle or carbine. 40 S&W cartridges typically are loaded with flat point or hollow point bullets, so they would stack safely in a tubular magazine, in contrast to something like a 9mm or a 45 ACP that typically have a long rounded nose. So I'm, with a short flat pointed cartridge like the 40 S&W, you could stack quite a few of them in a tubular magazine, and that might make for kind of a fun little lever action to shoot. And maybe I will eventually build some other semi-automatics from scratch. That just kind of remains to be seen. One thing I have thought would be a fun project would be to take a bolt-action rifle and convert it to semi-automatic. I've seen conversion kits like from the World War I era for some of these old military bolt-actions. I'm not sure I would trust any of those vintage rifles or devices today, but doing something conceptually similar, I think, would be an interesting project. And of course, I have some ideas for AR-15 mods that go a little bit beyond swapping out factory parts with drop-in replacements. We'll see how much of that I ever get to as well. Now, as I've said before, I basically make videos about anything that interests me, and so as much as I'm interested in firearms, I do have other interests as well. I would eventually like to make some more outdoor adventure type videos. If I could get a few spare batteries for my camera, I might be able to take it further afield and film a little bit more of that type of content. And then, I haven't really done much in the way of videos about my horsemanship hobby, but I've started building my own saddles, and I've come up with a sort of an unconventional saddle design that I really like a lot better than the conventional saddle designs. So at some point I want to do a video or possibly a series of videos on saddle making. And then, on an unrelated note, the other day I was just thinking that I haven't done a chemistry experiment for a long time. You know, it might be fun to build an apparatus for electrosynthesis of hydrogen peroxide or something like that. For that matter, it's been far too long since I've really done anything with electronics, so I'd like to do a few videos along those lines. Actually, kind of taking the electronics concept full circle back into ballistics, at some point I think it would be fun to build a railgun. I know I've seen a variety of railgun videos on YouTube, and I've really been kind of surprised at how little velocity they're getting out of them. I mean, of course, there's the General Atomics model that is backed by a multi-million-dollar defense contract and is obviously delivering a little bit more power downrange, but I think I can do better than what I've seen of home-built railguns so far. At least I'd like to try if I ever have time to do so. And yet, realistically, if I continue to just pursue these projects as a hobby the way I've been doing, the chances of me getting through everything that I've talked about here today within my lifetime are pretty small. And that is to say nothing about all of the ideas that I've either forgotten to mention or that I haven't come up with yet because, you know, for every project that I complete, I naturally come up with 2 or 3 more ideas for things that would be fun to do. And so, with as much growth as I've been seeing in the viewership of this channel this year, I've sort of been considering my options. As I said, so far I haven't really made that much money on advertising, and from what I've seen of other professional YouTubers, it sounds like ad revenue is really sort of sporadic. Even if you have a very large viewer base, it's not something that you want to be dependent on for your livelihood. Hence the reason that a lot of professional YouTubers seem to prefer setting up a Patreon page or something along those lines to have a more stable base of support. And so I went ahead and created a Patreon page. I figure if I can raise maybe $1,000 a month or so worth of donor support, that is not enough to live on in and of itself, but that's enough to convince me that if I quit my day job and did this full time, I probably could build up enough of a viewer base to support myself as a professional YouTuber. And in the meantime, you know, any funds that I collect through Patreon, you know, prior to reaching that $1,000 a month threshold, I would probably reinvest in the channel in terms of getting better equipment. You know, right now I'm doing my video editing on a computer that's about 10 years old and has developed a problem where the graphics card overheats and the computer shuts itself off when I'm in the middle of doing graphics-intensive activities like editing video. So that can be kind of annoying. That computer really does need to be replaced one of these days. But anyway, I guess the message of this video is that the future of the Idahoan show is really in your hands as viewers. If you like what you've seen on this channel and you think that it's worth taking to the next level and you'd like to help me take it to the next level, then I'll put a link to the Patreon page that I created in the description of the video, and you can help me do that. If I'm not able to raise enough support and this channel always just stays a hobby, then I guess I can live with that. Anyway, thank you for watching the Idahoan Show.